NewThing is a catalyst for movements of reproducing churches. There are several ways you can get involved. First, we want to begin a conversation with you about how you can plant a reproducing church. You do not want to do this on your own. Let us connect you with others who want to start reproducing churches. NewThing is a place where you can experience a culture of reproduction. Maybe you should do a leadership residency, or possibly you're planning a church. Together, let's start a movement. NewThing wants to help you start your church and the next one and the next one.
Hi, my name is John Ferguson, and I have had the privilege of being a part of NewThing from the very beginning. We started out as a handful of church planters, and our vision was to be a catalyst for a network of reproducing churches. Well, then our networks began to multiply, and we changed the vision to be a catalyst for networks of reproducing churches. Well, since that time, we have begun to see God moving in places all over the world. More and more amazing churches and networks have started and are coming together. Our vision now is to be a catalyst for movements of reproducing churches. Why are we so passionate about movement? Well, because when God moves, people find their way back to Him. And if we can reach just one person, we can reach a neighborhood. If we can reach a neighborhood, we could reach a city. And if we can reach an entire city like Chicago or New York or Nairobi, we can reach the world. I want to welcome you to NewThing Online. I'm so glad you've joined us for this broadcast. We want to bring you some of the most insightful voices and practitioners in the world of church planting. It's our hope and prayer that these online training opportunities will accomplish three objectives. One, we want to better equip NewThing network leaders and pastors. So network leaders, use the content from this online training to jumpstart your monthly network calls. And pastors for NewThing, we hope you will use this content to train your church staff and leaders. Secondly, we believe these broadcasts will create synergy throughout NewThing. We all know vision leaks, right? And we believe experiencing this training online will remind us all of why we do what we do and how together God is catalyzing movements of reproducing churches all over the world. Finally, we believe this kind of training gives prospective church planters one more reason to jump in with NewThing. God has blessed NewThing with access to some of the most cutting-edge thought leaders and practitioners. We know that we all can't afford to go to them, so we plan to bring them to you with fresh, new content every month. So with that in mind, we need your feedback and input. Let us know who you want to hear from or any topics you would love to have addressed. And thanks again for all you do to help more and more people find their way back to God.
NewThing leaders, what a privilege to be with you guys. I absolutely love leaders. I love the ministry that you guys do. I love your heart for churches and just sharing the gospel. So thank you all for what you do in ministry. I'm a self-proclaimed leadership junkie. I love all things leadership. And it is an honor to just be able to connect with you guys and share a little bit about my heart for leadership. I have served in the local church for about the last 11 or 12 years in the roles of executive director and executive pastor, working at large multi-site churches, and understand a bit of the dynamics of your world. And so I just wanted to share a little bit with you guys today of some of the things I'm learning about leadership and hopefully be a bit of an encouragement to you. I have kind of a theory on the trajectory of leadership. I think that healthy and thriving leaders lead to healthy and thriving teams, which lead to healthy and thriving churches, which ultimately leads to the extraordinary impact or the fulfillment of the visions that we're all called to. And I suspect that you guys would agree with that as well. I think John Maxwell says everything rises and falls on leadership. And that's been something that I hold really deeply as a leader, of just recognizing that a lot rises and falls on the shoulders of a leader. And so the healthier we are, the more that we're thriving in our leadership, the better our teams are going to be, our organizations and the ministries that we serve. And so I don't know about you guys, but the reality is I'm far from an extraordinary leader. In fact, if I go all the way back, my early career was in the music business, and my first real leadership moment was a colossal disaster. I was about 22 years old and was working at this record company. newly promoted to the role of manager, which involved leading my first employee. So I had like the first person that wasn't an intern or a volunteer, but like a paid individual who was working for me and working on my team. And so as you can imagine, I was incredibly proud of this opportunity, like a little bit of arrogance and my youthfulness was showing up. And within a couple weeks, I was really discouraged and frustrated with this employee. Like they were just not meeting my expectations. And so I went to my boss and just said, look, this employee's not working. You know, we're gonna have to do something about this. They're just not doing what I said they should do. They're not fulfilling, you know, all the responsibilities that I gave them in the way that I would like them to do them. And, you know, just continued to rant and rant and rant. And my leader stopped me and he said, Jenni, if you wanna work with widgets, go work in a factory. But if you wanna work with people, you're gonna have to learn how to love them and lead them. And to some degree, that feels a little obvious, right? But I think, you know, to me as a young leader, it was a defining moment for me because it really solidified the importance of leadership is really about others. Leadership is about investing my life into the development of others. And I realized that I had a lot of work to do. I realized that it was kind of that beginning point where I recognized that leadership is not about my success or my future even. It's really about the people that I'm leading and the people I'm investing in. And so I felt like I had a lot of work to do to become the leader that I longed to be. One of the things that really sits with me often is this idea that leadership shapes human lives. Like leadership shapes human lives, and for that reason, it is sacred work. Like we get this sacred work of partnering with God to lead others, and that might mean some of the staff that you lead. It obviously means the congregations that you lead, but leadership shapes human lives, and for that reason, it is incredibly sacred work, and I think it deserves our best intentionality behind it. But the reality is leadership is also really hard. You guys know this. You've been through the dark days of leadership. You've had those really difficult moments, and you know that it's a difficult calling. It's a weighty responsibility. And I suspect for most of you church leaders, church planters, you feel that weight of leadership responsibility every day. I think you probably get this, probably in a really significant way. Paul David Tripp says this. He says, embedded in the larger story of redemption is a principle we must not miss. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things in the lives of others. Now, I find a lot of hope in that because I recognize all those moments where I fall short as a leader. And Paul David Tripp is saying in this that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things in the lives of others. And so there's that sacred work, there's that sacred responsibility of leadership. And it's challenged me with the question, how do I move from this ordinariness to having extraordinary impact? And that search for me, this search for how to become an extraordinary leader, like I was looking for a framework, a hero to model my life and leadership after, like something that I could tangibly get my head around to help me lead from a healthier place, to help me lead with more authenticity, to lead with more of the character of Christ. And as I studied and searched and looked for things, I found myself coming back to one of the most fundamental scriptures, one of the most fundamental components of our faith, and it's in Mark chapter 12, passage that you guys are going to be super familiar with. If you go to verses 30 and 31, Jesus is being challenged with controversial questions about taxes and resurrection, like really exciting stuff. And then the final question posed to him was, which commandment is the most important of all? You guys know this stuff, but how does he respond? He responds with something we know as the Great Commandment, or often known as the Shema. And it says this, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then he followed it with the second greatest commandment, which was love your neighbor as yourself. See, and before I jump into the application of this, I kind of want to point out, I had done some research and study behind this, and it's important to understand that in Jewish tradition, the Shema is recited 3 times a day as part of their devotional life. So this is really core to the Jewish people and their faith. The Baker Encyclopedia explains it this way. It says, within the Shema is found both a fundamental doctrinal truth and a resultant obligation. See, there's an urgency connected to the teaching because the word Shema demands that the hearer respond with his total being to the fact and the demands of this essential revelation. So the core of it is love God, love others, and what they're saying is that the fundamental point behind this is that we're supposed to respond with our whole being. That's why Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. He's essentially saying those four things comprise your whole being. And when that commandment, that great commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, means to love with our whole being. And so this became really critical to me in my journey as a leader, because when Jesus asked us to love God with our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, he was essentially saying that we should love God with all of ourselves, with everything in us. And when he says to love your neighbor as yourself, again, the implication is to love with all of who we are. And so when I consider my life as a leader, it means leading with all of who I am for the benefit of God and for others. And I think this gets to the core, that heart of leadership, that great commandment of leadership, so to speak, is I think this framework is so critical because when I look at my life and the lives of others, many of us tend to lead from one or two of these dimensions. So if you start thinking about it, heart, soul, mind, and strength, well, some of us lead with one or two of them really well, and some of the others are kind of non-existent. Some of you lead with a lot of heart, especially in ministry. We lead with a lot of heart, but we might lack some strategy or vision. Others of you, those of you maybe a little more wired like me, we lead with a lot of strategy and a lot of vision, but we can lack some heart and soul. I've been called heartless a time or two in my leadership. And there's a reason for that. There's a part of me that naturally is wired to love and lead with one or two of those dimensions, but I might ignore the other ones. And I think this is why this great commandment is so critical to us. So let me tell you about each one of the dimensions and what I think they mean for us when it comes to leadership. Leading with all your heart is really that relational side of leadership. See, the heart of the leader is the truest part of who you are. Your heart is the center of your emotions, your desires, your wishes. Your heart is what most connects you with others. Love God, love others begins here in the heart. It's the relational dimension of leadership. And when we lead from the heart, we see other people as living, human, breathing, people with stories, emotions, families. They have strengths and weaknesses. They have tragedies and joys. We start to see the human behind them. This was what I wasn't doing with that first employee. I just saw what he was producing, not who he was as a person. And when we see those we lead as human, we seek to relate to them through our God-given power to understand one another through emotional connection. See, this relational component is so important to our leadership because it really sets the foundation. It's the truest part of who we are. And I suspect a lot of you get that one. And then leading with all your soul. It's kind of the spiritual awareness of leadership. The soul is the part of us that longs to know God. It's the epicenter of morality, integrity, humility, and servanthood. It's the spiritual component of our leadership. And it gives us the sensitivity to engage in the conversations that help lead people closer to God. It's a distinction that really sets us apart as faith-based leaders. And you would think that in ministry, this is one we would get. And I think we do, obviously, especially in regard to our congregations. But sometimes with those that are closest to us, the people we're leading day in and day out, our staff or our volunteers, we can miss this one. We get a little wrapped up in the doing the ministry, the busy work of ministry, and sometimes we can lack a little soul in our leadership, lack a little bit of that spiritual dimension. So it's one for us to keep our eyes on as ministry leaders. And then leading with all your mind. This is the strategic or the managerial dimension of leadership. This one is the one that I see in churches tends to be overused or underused, in that sometimes we can be afraid of being too corporate or having too many systems, too business-like, and so we won't really lean into strategy or management practices. Or then we might go to the other end of the spectrum when we start doing some of those things and we get criticized for being too corporate or our ministry or our culture lacking a little heart. So this is one I see us often on one end of the spectrum or the other, and again, it's just part of the equation. The mind is the seat of intellectual activity. It's what enables us to deliberate, to process, to ponder, to reflect. Like, what God has enabled our minds to do is absolutely beautiful and magnificent. It's where we find clarity, and it's where God imparts wisdom. And we know that as leaders, we are constantly praying for God to impart wisdom, to give us wisdom beyond our years or experience for us to lead well. The mind can be viewed as the managerial component. It's the method by which great vision is often executed. It's the get it done component of leadership. It allows us to take a leader's instincts and inspiration and put them into action. So the mind just enables us to kind of put action to some of that vision and some of the ministry responsibilities that we have. And then leading with all your strength, the fourth dimension, is really the visionary component of leadership. See, as leaders, and you guys know this stuff, we provide strength for our teams when we understand the power of vision, when we're helping people understand where we're going and why we're going there, and we are tethered to that vision that God has given us, and we're helping everybody else kind of see that vision and giving people kind of those next steps to seeing that vision lived out. Those we lead must know that we deeply believe in where we're leading them and why we're leading them there. See, vision provides hope and possibility. It just provides hope and possibility and keeps us tethered to that thing that God has called us to. See, everything we do as leaders affects the people we lead, and I think this is why this framework is so valuable to me. This idea that the Great Commandment, one of the most simple and fundamental elements of our faith, gives us a framework that I think we as leaders can engage and employ, and I think it will change the trajectory of your leadership. It has changed mine. By learning and creating and having a greater awareness of all four dimensions and seeing them play out in my life, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that's really what I'm getting at here. None of us will be perfect in all of these, right? It's this greater awareness of how all four of them really encompass our whole being, and that those we lead need us to bring all of ourselves to the leadership table. Extraordinary leadership emerges from a commitment deep within us. When heart, soul, mind, and strength leaders know their leadership and understand their leadership and their influence, and we know it takes work, we know it takes engagement, commitment, perseverance, like all of those things, determination. Leadership is hard work. It's a weighty responsibility. We get that. But I want to remind you of Philippians 1, verse 6, a passage you're super familiar with, but it says, "For I'm confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus." And I think that's the thing, that if I can encourage you and prod you and yet also take a little bit of the weight off, to say that I think God has called us to be extraordinary leaders. But extraordinary doesn't mean perfect. And that's what I love about this passage, because extraordinary means the pursuit of God's great commandment. Did you catch that? Perfected until. Like, perfection isn't to be attained this side of heaven, but there's a perfecting that's going on. There's a continued work that God is doing in us. And as we grow as leaders, that perfection, that perfecting is continuing. And in the pursuit of leading with our heart, with our soul, and with our strength, the perfecting continues. God continues to refine our leadership in the lives of the people we lead. So this is my continued prayer, and it's my encouragement for all of you guys. May your leadership be an overflow of all of who you are: heart, soul, mind, and strength, for the benefit of others and the glory of God.